Hey everybody, Neil Thompson, founder of Teach the Geek here. I work with technical professionals so they can present more effectively, especially in front of non-technical audiences. And you can learn more about that at teachthegeek.com. Again, that's teachthegeek.com. And always please remember to like and subscribe to this YouTube channel because every little bit helps. You want a tip on how to make a technical presentation more interesting? May I suggest the idea of a callback? Now, you might be wondering, what's a callback? Well, they're actually used quite often in stand-up comedy. And for those of you all that don't know, I find stand-up comedians to be the best speakers because not only do they have to be comfortable on stage, they also have to be funny all at the same time, and that's not easy to do. And that's all I'll say about that. It's difficult. I've tried it. It's not easy. So, so what does callback have to do with technical presentations? Well, think of something that you mentioned during the presentation, and then near the end of the presentation, essentially calling back to what you had mentioned earlier in the presentation, which is the reason why it's called a callback. Basically, you're hearkening back to something that you had previously mentioned during the presentation. And what it does is it ties a nice bow really around the presentation so that when you end it, then you have this callback. So let's think of an example. Let's just say that in the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned chemical that was used during one of your experiments, and this chemical for this the use of this chemical caused this particular reaction, and perhaps you talk about that during your presentation, so that at the end of your presentation, you may mention the chemical again. So it kind of so when people hear that, they think, oh yeah, that he did mention that, or he or she did mention that chemical earlier on in the presentation. And but of course, if you're going to use a callback, you need to use something that makes sense. So I mean, hopefully in this instance, this idea of the chemical, certainly it could make sense just based on the context. But of course, you work your own presentation to pick something that makes sense to mention near the end of the presentation. I just came up with that example of a chemical just off the top of my head, actually. But ultimately, when it comes to any technical presentation, there's certainly aspects of it that you could call back to at near the end of your presentation for it to make sense. Let me think of a better example. And you know what? Here's a better example. I worked in orthobiologics, which is the use of human cadaver bone to make implants, typically spinal implants, but it could be other implants too, just bone implants. So something I could have mentioned during my presentation was visiting the tissue bank and the where a lot of these bone implants are made, and the idea of the smell that happens at these tissue banks. Bone being cut is not a pleasant smell at all, and I could be talking about that during my presentation. And then near the end of the presentation, I can mention something like, well, at least it's not. Hopefully, this presentation wasn't as smelly as that bone bank that I visited all those years ago. You know, it's kind of funny, I guess, but it certainly can harken back to when I was talking about the tissue bank and the bone being cut. That's essentially an example of a callback. So I highly suggest trying to use them during your technical presentations. It's certainly not something that a whole lot of people would ever think to do because, as I mentioned, they're using stand-up comedy, and well, technical presentations and stand-up comedy, you don't typically put those in the same sentence. But certainly, if you can use something from one to improve the other, well, why not try? Again, my name is Neil Thompson, founder of Teach the Geek. I work with technical professionals so they can present more effectively, especially in front of non-technical audiences. And you can learn more about that at teachthegeek.com. Again, that's teachthegeek.com. Until next time, take care and stay safe.